Hi, good morning, afternoon, or evening. This is Dr. Frehiwot. So I thought this week, instead of responding to each of you in the stark contradictions discussion post about Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Dubois, I thought I would, come and put together a sort of collective response about sort of some of your discussions. And I think that what that does is it's going to kind of, open up the conversation, and then also it will really kind of like put some things into perspective. So first off, congratulations on making it through to week 4. We are sort of at the tail end of this semester. Everyone has done an excellent job. Everyone has really taken their discussion seriously. Some folks who were challenged a little bit with putting details in their discussions have really improved. So I'm really excited and happy about sort of the improvement of the course. So congratulations. Give yourself a hand. Then I also want to just kind of, highlight a couple of key things about this concept of sort of these two ideologues, right, who have different perspectives on the way forward for enslaved Africans. And when we say ideologues, we really are talking about, these two people or Africans or whoever. I mean, ideologues can be anybody. Marx is an ideologue, Lenin is an ideologue, Kwame Nkrumah is an ideologue, but these two folks who have like these distinct ideologies, right? And their principles and ideology based on study and research really sort of guides the way that they view the world, and then also guides sort of the way that they think that contradictions should be resolved. So we've got these two sort of like opposing ideologues, theoretically opposing, because are they really opposing? And on the one hand, we've got, the Booker T. Washingtons, right? And Booker T. Washington really is a very pragmatic, practical man. He's absolutely 100%, down for eradicating slavery. And what he recognizes is that, it's not enough just to pass a law that slavery is abolished, but African people must gain sort of practical skills to build their economy, which I think is a very valid and valuable point, right? So when he's talking about becoming a carpenter and getting into the agricultural field and really being able to build buildings and really be able to sort of build this economy, be able to sort of manage your own affairs, as Dr. Osajifo Kwame Nkrumah, the first president of Ghana said, that African people need to manage their own affairs. So I think that that's a particularly significant piece of, Booker T. Washington's ideology, right? His analysis. I think another thing that we have to recognize about his analysis is also about his, upbringing, right? So where did Booker T. Washington grow up? Booker T. Washington was born a slave, right? And so being born a slave and sort of seeing the, work as work with your hands, not necessarily intellectual work, but work with your hands being the primary sort of driver of success. That also sort of drove his analysis of hands-on work being something that will advance African people. So that's number one. The second thing that I think is key, which I think is also very valid, is that his analysis of sort of the way to address the equality issue between Africans and the majority of the society, or really the exploitation and oppression of African people, is to feed the people, right? And to give them opportunities to actually feed themselves. There's that proverb that says if you give a man a fish, he'll be back for fish. If you teach a man to fish, he'll be able to sustain himself. That's not exactly how the proverb goes, but that's something similar to that. So that's what Booker T. Washington was really saying. He's saying, listen, we need to teach the people how to, be masons, how to, plant, how to, grow food, how to, really build an economy around this particular community. And so that I think is very significant. The challenge, though, becomes if you're in a society which does not respect and understand equality, specifically around people of African descent, how do you maintain autonomy within that society, right? So you may learn how to fish, how to build houses, how to, run your economy. You may, teach the people how to, teach at a local primary school or whatever the case may be. But then if you're living in a society which is unequal, which ultimately even based on the law, there's oppressive tactics towards people of African descent. How do you live a free life, right? So if the laws are the same or they're very similar to that during the slave era, which ultimately basically limits what African people can do and what they can achieve. How do you as an African move forward and then sort of chart a new path if you're building sort of this community sort of that's isolated from the larger society? Because ultimately you have to be isolated. Although he said, cast down your buckets where you are, you're casting your buckets where you are, but you're still sort of on the outskirts of society, right? You're still not part and parcel of the majority of society. You're still not in the legislature. You're still not, making decisions. You're still not really able to advocate on behalf of your people. So that becomes a real challenge, particularly when economies get hard. That is when you find that there's sort of these anti-immigrant, xenophobic attacks, these anti-African attacks, when you have a really hard economy. And when laws are there to then back up this type of behavior, whether it's, lynchings, whether it's, looting, whether it's running people out of town, whether it's beatings, whatever the case may be, whether it's, looking at a white woman and then you then can be charged with rape. All of these things, although you can, till the land, although you can grow food, although you've built buildings, although you're teaching, folks to be educators, how do you address those issues, right, through this real practical stuff? So, I think that that's one real challenge with the Booker T. Washington approach. And I just want to kind of read something quickly because I think it's interesting. He says, to those of the white race who look to the incoming of those of foreign birth and strange tongue and habits for the prosperity of the South, were I permitted, I would repeat what I say to my own race. Cast down your bucket where you are. Cast it down among the 8 million of Negroes whose habit you know, whose fidelity and love you have tested in days when to have proved treacherous meant the ruin of your firesides. Cast down your bucket among these people who have, without strikes and labor wars, tilled your fields, cleared your forests, built your railroads and cities, and brought forth treasures from the bowels of the earth, and helped make possible this magnificent representation of the progress of the South. So when you think about this, Booker T. Washington is saying, listen, white race, African people have ultimately been slaves for you. They've fought in your wars, right? Why are you looking to bring work from outside of this particular community? And so that also really speaks to sort of the value that African people had in the country, in that they were not even human enough to, take on some of these key responsibilities, such as building railroads, right? So because we know that the Chinese came in and built railroads, and be clear, there was a lot of Chinese immigrants that were treated absolutely horrendously, but you have to also wonder you have to wonder about sort of the disconnect between people of African descent and people who are Asian today, and where that originated from. So when you think about this, Booker T. Washington is ultimately asking people of European descent, take us back. We've stood by you. We've loved you. We've built this nation. We deserve a chance. And the question becomes, can you ever ask your oppressor for your freedom, right? And I think that's a fundamental flaw or challenge I think that many people see with Booker T. Washington's oppression. So that's sort of on one position. That's sort of on one side. This ideologue was really about the practicality of work and really pushing pushing people to be able to sort of manage their own affairs and to live their lives sort of off the land, right? And I think that there's a lot of value in that position. We'll come back to that. Then on the other hand, you've got this ideologue, W.E.B. Dubois, who is an intellectual, right? Like, we have to be honest about that. He's an intellectual, graduated from Harvard, right? The first African to get a PhD at Harvard University. Went to schools in the North, with European counterparts and European colleagues, right? So basically went to school with white people, okay? In a time when you couldn't really mix. He was able to see that legislations and laws is what changes society, right? And so his view and education really can open your mind and open your worldview, right? And so one of his major critiques of Booker T. Washington was having a really insular worldview, right? And not recognizing the impact that laws and education can have on sort of the liberation of African people, right? Because we know that around this time there was Emancipation Proclamation, but that didn't necessarily free enslaved Africans, right? It freed some, but it didn't necessarily mean that the conditions were equal. And then when you think about W.E.B. Du Bois, you think about this concept of, sort of taking education and using it as a catalyst or as a vehicle to really empower people of African descent. There's a quote by Ahmed Sékou Touré, who is the first president of Guinea in West Africa, and he basically said, it's better to have an entire nation that has a sixth grade education than to have a nation with the majority of people who are illiterate or don't have access to education, but you have a few people who have high degrees. So that's the same sort of, I think, perspective that W.E.B. Du Bois was really pushing, this concept of really educating the people to sort of manage their own affairs. So we see sort of two different pieces. We see, with the Booker T's, he's talking about practical, using your hands to manage your own affairs. And W.E.B. Du Bois is saying, listen, we must manage our own affairs through education. We must manage our own affairs through expanding our worldview. We must manage our own affairs through becoming, part and parcel of the law, right? Changing laws in the country. And so Booker T. Washington's approach is really an approach that is about sort of systematic change, right? So really this macro level systematic change, while you see Booker T. Washington is really at the micro level, and he's really saying, listen, we need to figure out how to feed the people today. Also, when you think about W.E.B. Du Bois, when you think about his concept of the talented 10th, right? And so he's ultimately saying that there's sort of a 10% of the African world or African population in the U.S. at the time, has higher degrees or has access to education. And so that 10% should ultimately take on the responsibility to sort of chart the path of the new path of people of African descent within the U.S. Organize and struggle with the legislator at the time, try to get in Congress, really try to change laws, because changing laws is really what's going to free African people. The other thing that W.E.B. Du Bois really pushed was his concept of having, propaganda in newspapers and really writing in newspapers about the struggles in which African people were facing, to not just expose people of African descent to the ills that were going on in the U.S., but to also then expose the world, right? So remember that W.E.B. Du Bois had this sort of exhibit in Paris, I believe, of sort of the different faces of African people, and they were not necessarily all enslaved Africans. And so he was really also trying to push, even with like the souls of Black folks, really trying to push through the world to see the ills and how African people were being treated inside the U.S., right? So that's sort of this strategy of not only just opening up the worldview of African people, but also sort of exposing African people, exposing the world to the treatment of African people in the U.S. And so when you think about that approach, you think, well, he's really looking at changing the system, right, for sort of a long-term macro resolution to African people being oppressed. Now, the contradiction, of course, everyone has a contradiction, right? Everything is dialectical, which means there's good and bad in everything, right? And so with W.E.B. Du Bois's approach, the challenge becomes, how do you feed the people today? Right? How do you teach the people to fish today when you don't have a fishing rod, right? And so the question becomes, or not a fishing rod, when you have laws that say you can go and fish, but you have no boats to fish, right? So the question becomes with the W.E.B. Du Bois approach is, how do you address, hunger and poverty? How do you address the fact that African people are, disproportionately left out of the workforce at the time? How do you, address the fact that when slavery was ended, as African people, you had a choice. Do I become a sharecropper, or do I stay on the plantation? Do I move away? What do I do? I have nothing that really can build the economy as an individual as well as collectively. So that, I think, is definitely an issue. And I think the other point is that when you think about where these two folks grew up, really the rural South and then the North, where in the North you had a lot of infrastructure, right? In the rural South, the infrastructure wasn't there as much. It was really about how do you feed yourself and your family, because the system will not do that. In the North, there was more infrastructure. So that infrastructure ultimately became sort of a vehicle to empower people from Du Bois's perspective, specifically from an education perspective and changing laws. So now, when we're thinking about sort of merging these two approaches, because I think many people have said, oh, I think it would be great if they would have come together. And I think that you're absolutely correct, but I think that we have to also be a little bit strategic and critically analyze why they were apart, right? So like on one hand, we have to ask ourselves, who was backing both of these great ideologues, these great African men? Who was funding their campaigns, right? Did these, and I don't necessarily have the answer to this question, but did the funders sort of have their own agenda, right? So that's the first issue with the Booker T of really just creating sort of workhorses, right, that could do the practical work but really weren't able to think. Because ultimately you've got some, white Southerners who were pushing that African people learn how to work with their hands, right, but not necessarily pushing that they work with their minds, right, because intellectually that's work as well, right, intellectual work. Just like the work that we're doing here is intellectual work. So that's the question. And then you even have on the Du Bois side, who was funding Du Bois, right? Because there were also probably white Northerners that were pushing let's educate African people, recognizing that the key is education, but if you can't feed yourself, you have a problem. So I think that that's the other piece. And the other thing is we have to also look at the political climate. What was going on, around the world? There was still colonialism in Africa. There was still sort of these colonies that were sort of oppressing other nations. And so it becomes very difficult to chart a new path of African people in the U.S. when you still have, colonization on the African continent. So here are some political pieces. Just sort of to close up. Two things. One, I think it's important to, critically analyze sort of the merits of both. So I think that there really are merits of both. I think you absolutely have to have education, and you have to be able to sort of change the laws of the land, wherever the land is, in order to benefit all people, all specifically African people, right? Because if the laws are against African people, like if you're a runaway slave, for example, and the law says that if you're caught, you can then be, wherever you happen to be, if you're captured, you can be then taken back to your slave master, even if it's 10, 20 years down the line. It doesn't benefit you, right? No matter how much education you have. We've all seen the movie 12 Years a Slave. If you haven't, I strongly recommend you see it. That movie is about like this free African who ended up being captured because they thought he was a slave, but ultimately he was just an African. He ended up serving, 12 years as a slave and then was able to finally get exonerated and fought for his freedom. Then when you think about this concept of, so I've diverged a bit, but I want to just kind of keep us in the analysis. So you're thinking about these laws and education and sort of expanding our worldview, right? Because I think it's also important to look at the larger context of African people, right? And how African people from a larger perspective have been oppressed as well, not just in America, but around the world, because we're looking at 1804, Haiti gained their independence. Then when you think about sort of the impact of W.E.B. Du Bois, Booker T. Washington, and his approach of really, putting together, I'm not sure why I'm so popular, but his approach of really putting together this practical skills that people of African descent need, I think is absolutely significant and important, because if you don't feed yourself, how are you going to eat, right? How are you going to even think about education, right? So please excuse that interruption. But if you don't feed yourself, and you don't know how to feed yourself in an economy that doesn't have grocery stores or doesn't have, available resources for former enslaved Africans, how are you going to eat? If you're moving off of the plantation where you used to get your food, although it was horrible food, how will you feed yourself and your children? So it becomes a real dichotomy of, is it the practical work that we need? Is it the laws and education, or is it both? And many of you have contended, and I contend, that there really needs to be a marrying of the two, right? We need to have access to education, which is like political education. We need to have access to, social education, economic education to make collective economic decisions. And we also need some practical skills to feed ourselves and our families, right? And to also build an economy. Like there are many, smaller African communities which were building an economy, but we need a large economy to do some level of negotiation with. And so, I think that those are some of the key pieces that I would like to highlight with this discussion about stark choices. Hopefully you gained something and enjoyed it. And as usual, I'm here to support you. Good luck with your annotated bibliography, which is due the end of the week. And I look forward to chatting with you all either offline or online. Happy writing, happy reading, and I hope you have a great day. Thanks a lot.